Hey YouTube, it's me, Joe, and I'm back with another reaction. Alright. First of all, thank you to my first new patron. I know I said I usually thank people, but I already have my first patron. Thank you, Andrew. I'm not sure if it's my Andrew or if it's another Andrew. Either way, thank you very much for the very first patron. Thank you very much. Secondly, this video. Okay, so today I was having a little issue figuring out what specifically I wanted to react to. Would I go back and do another reaction to an MLP Tumblr dub? Would I do a TF2 video? I was thinking about doing starting to do hat stereotypes because it was requested of me. Or should I get back to extra history or another Emperor's text-to-speech device? And then, after a while thinking, I settled on this. Now, the reason I settled on this is because today, the day this is coming out, is Veterans Day. And I, like many other people, have family history that is closely tied to the military. But I also wanted to. But Veterans Day is more than just an American holiday because it actually has two. This holiday, this date, has two different names. There's Veterans Day, which most people know, but then there's the second name, and this one's a lot older. Armistice Day. Because on this day, the 11th day of the 11th month, at the 11th hour, World War I officially came to an end. Yes. At this point in time, over 100 years ago, 4 years worth of fighting ended. Some of the most brutal combat that has ever been seen on the face of the earth. And I wanted to do something special with it. So today, everyone knows, excuse me, everyone really knows the story of what happened during the war and what especially happened after the war and some of the repercussions of the war. But it's actually surprising, not a lot of people fully understand or know why it started to begin with. It was a giant kerfuffle, to put it mildly. Most people do know that it started when a man shot the Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand. But most people won't tell you why he shot him, or what drew all these nations into this. Well, today I figured I would show you. Extra Credit has done an entire series of videos called The Seminal Tragedy, which is basically all the stuff that led up to the First World War. And I'm actually going to do it in its entirety. One solid go. So this is definitely going to be a long one, but I encourage all of you to watch through this because it is very incredible history. And actually, believe it or not, a lot of it is still affecting us today. Not just the after effects of World War I, but some of the stuff that is still that started World War I is still going on to this day. And you might be able to see it. And you'll also, so please, I encourage you all to try and stick around as long as you can, because this is going to be a long one, at least 30 minutes, maybe 40. So please join me, Koa, and Luna as we do this. So let's start the Seminal Tragedy, shall we? All right, let's get these videos started in 3, 2, 1, and play.
Human history is equal parts heroism, tragedy, and misunderstanding. Very rarely have we displayed all three to such a degree as in the First World War. This war is called the seminal catastrophe of the 20th century, because without it there is no Stalin and no Hitler, no fascism or World War II. Without it, we don't have a Cold War that leads us to the very brink of annihilation, nor do we see the Middle East carved up by old men, still bitter from 4 years of meaningless, self-inflicted catastrophe. Without this war, we probably don't have 9/11 or the turmoil in the Middle East today. This war ushered in the modern age, born in a crucible of gunpowder and toxic smoke and the blood of 10 million men. Blood spilt in war from the fields of France to the waters off America, from the Russian frontier to the sands of the Middle East, from the Chinese mainland to the deepest parts of the sea. This war broke empires. It shattered the past and forced us to give up our last ties to our medieval understanding. When the smoke cleared and a stunned world climbed out of its trenches, we lived in a new age, with new powers, new ideas, and new terrors. It is the defining event of the 20th century. It is the Great War. But it's not the war itself that we're here to talk about today. Hopefully, over the course of this show, a bit at a time, we'll slowly, story by story, cover the sprawling events of this turning point in history. But today we are focused on the events that led to this war. For if the war itself is the seminal catastrophe of the 20th century, then the weeks before the war are its seminal tragedy. In these next few episodes, we'll focus on the very human, very personal stories that led Europe to consume itself, to ignite itself in one suicidal blaze from which it still hasn't recovered, because it is a tragedy of the highest order.
Never will.
It's like a play, a Greek epic, a story so grand we would think it must be fiction, if the scars of the war couldn't still be seen on the fields of France. It's Shakespeare living out before us. It begins with the death of a prince and his lady, and ends in mass slaughter the likes of which the world has never seen. So let's set the stage. For 100 years, Europe has been at peace. There have been wars, sure, but they were minor wars. Wars on the periphery. Wars without many of the great powers involved. Not since Napoleon did the great states of Europe vie in bloody battle. For after the ravages of the Napoleonic Wars, the statesmen of Europe had come together to try to stop such a catastrophe from ever happening again. They created a system called the Concert of Europe, so that whenever war seemed perilously close, the nations of Europe would come together in a conference, and instead come to a settlement that all parties would abide by. But Europe has changed since those weary of the Napoleonic conflicts first came together to create the Great Concert. The first and most major change was the formation of Germany. At the time our story begins, it's important to remember Germany as a nation was only 40 years old. It's a young nation, a strong one, a nation looking to claim its own. But to say that Germany was a strong nation is to undersell the magnitude of its creation. I mean to say that the birth of Germany was something perhaps unique in the history of the world.
It totally shifted
overnight,
the balance.
with the signing of a few papers, the middle of Europe was transformed from 1,000 tiny squabbling states to the greatest land power the world had ever known. In one night, suddenly the most powerful nations of Europe, Russia, France, Austria-Hungary, and England, were not the most powerful nations in Europe any longer. Overnight, in the very heart of Europe, had been created a nation with more manpower, natural resources, and economic strength than any other nation in the world except perhaps for Great Britain. Moreover, this creation was cemented in the defeat of France, which at the time was considered the strongest land power in Europe. And at the time of our story, that defeat and its memory still run deep. And now, look at the world from the perspective of that powerful new German nation. Here they are, arguably the most powerful country in the world, and yet they see themselves being denied all the rights of a great world power. Britain and France held territories across the globe. Even the Netherlands, a nation which the might of the new Germany could wipe off the face of the earth in a week, had colonies from Asia all the way to Africa.
Really.
But Germany, for all of their strength, had been denied those possessions simply because their nation was young. Imagine what this does to the balance of power. Imagine what this does to the geopolitical scene. Think what would happen today if, say, the entire EU declared themselves a single nation with a single economy, a single military, and a single foreign policy. Imagine if they said that they wanted greater access to Middle Eastern oil, and Russia and the United States said, no, we were here first. Imagine now if representatives from Russia and the United States smiled and told this young nation that they'd be happy to continue to sell them oil at an inflated price, though. This was the position Germany found itself in. How was the Concert of Europe, a system built around a balance of power and compromise, to last in these circumstances? And yet, for 40 years, it did, and this brings us to the second major change since the Napoleonic Wars: the men. The 70 years after those wars was a time of giants, men who towered over the world stage. Time and again here, Europe rolled well on the dice of history and came up with leaders who were capable of navigating an increasingly complex and increasingly modern geopolitical world. In the 1800s, Russians saw men like Alexander II, who understood that Russia needed to modernize to survive. He began dismantling serfdom, reformed judicial practices, encouraged universities, and pursued peace, understanding that Russia was in no position to fight the major European powers. Like all the men here, this guy was not all chuckles and sunshine. Alexander II brutally suppressed revolutionaries and separatists in the territories Russia controlled. Still, he was effective, without question. By 1900, we have in Russia Nicholas II, a deeply reactionary, deeply conservative man, who history records as being of middling intellect, with neither the training nor the inclination to properly rule. His reign is a catalogue of embarrassing mismanagement. This is the man who fell under the sway of the mystic Rasputin. This is a man who couldn't even coordinate his own coronation. A man who let 1,300 people die in a human stampede on the day he was crowned, because, I kid you not, there was not enough beer and pretzels. And this is the man who held a ball that day anyway, because, hey, why let a few hundred deaths spoil your day? And this is the man who will, in the end, hold the fate of the world in his hands. And by this point in Austria, we have as emperor an 84-year-old man, 2 years away from his death and battered by the weight of the life he's led. His foreign minister, Berthold, is neither a bad man nor a stupid man, but he is a weak and vacillating man at a time when European politics are all about strength. And Germany? Germany, during the 20 years following its creation, had unquestionably one of the greatest diplomats the world has ever seen. Otto von Bismarck. This is a man of great ability and great appetites. A man known to smoke 3 cigars at once and down a bottle of champagne at breakfast.
And have by far the greatest mustache
an entire episode just to himself.
ever.
But for our purposes, he is the man
Honestly,
who held the
Dusty-
concert of Europe together
Dusty got it
under the
from
incredible
somewhere,
strain
and it
of the
was Otto
creation of the
von
new German
Bismarck.
state. His life's work was to ensure that France and Russia never allied, so
Come
that
to think
Germany
of it,
would never
Dusty
be
looks a
surrounded.
lot like
This
Otto
was
von
his
Bismarck.
nightmare, his greatest fear. And in this, like in many things, he turned out to be right. He famously said that the great European conflagration would come from some damn fool thing in the Balkans, and he warned Kaiser Wilhelm II that within 20 years, his bellicose policies would destroy the Kaiserreich. And he was correct almost to the day.
Oh yeah,
But
he was only off by like, I
Kaiser
think, 4
Wilhelm
months.
II, who has too much historical baggage to get an accurate view of. Suffice it to say that the Kaiser often ends up with a reputation for feeling inadequate. Having been born with a withered arm and grown up hounded by his mother, he came to believe that he had to prove he was masculine, and so set out to break with Bismarck's policies and show that he was his own man by abandoning the German alliance with Russia and moving Germany towards a much more expansionist stance. He was known for being brash and impulsive, with little tact, crumbling the carefully balanced alliances that had for so long kept the concert of Europe in place. Now to all this, we have to add one last piece to the stage. Fear. The fear of the dying empires. The fear of those once great nations that now so clearly saw the shadow of death approaching them from behind. The Ottoman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Russian Empire.
All about to die.
The Ottoman Empire was long known as the sick man of Europe. Its decline had been long and slow, with the surrounding nations taking bites out of its carcass as it slowly died. The Austro-Hungarian Empire looked at the fate of the Ottomans and saw shadows of what was to come. They feared they'd be like the Ottomans, dismantled, taken apart piece by piece until they were too weak to fight back. They had once been the most powerful state in Europe, but they ruled over many nations and many peoples, and over the 19th century those peoples had asserted themselves, crying out for their own nations, crying out to be free, to, as people, decide their own fate. And so, through the 19th century, the Austro-Hungarian Empire saw its territory chipped away, as the other great nations of the concert of Europe ruled in their conferences that those people had a right to be free. And with each loss, those peoples that the Austro-Hungarian Empire still maintained control of agitated for their own freedom to a greater and greater extent, causing unrest that rocked the empire to its very core. And lastly, we have the Russians. The Russian Tsars ruled the largest country in the world, but, like the Ottomans, their military, economy, and infrastructure were woefully behind the times. And in 1905, when the Russians lost a war with the Japanese, the first time a European power had lost a war to an Asian one in modern history, their weakness became eminently clear to the world. This loss caused a revolution that forced the Tsar to accept a parliament and a constitutional monarchy. But it wasn't in the nature of Alexander II to accept a parliament, and he rebelled against these constraints, leaving his country precariously perched on the verge of revolution. So with a new superpower in the midst of Europe, fear driving crumbling empires to irrational and desperate decisions, and a group of leaders simply not equal to their forebearers at the task of guiding the ships of state, the players are all in place. The stage is set, and the curtain begins to rise on the war to end all wars. Join us next time for an improbable assassination, the death of a prince, and a sandwich which changed history.
Oh, yeah. The dying empires, that was the greatest fear back then. Because it wasn't really the falling of empires. That what they were worried about most of all was following the route of Britain, which was a constitutional monarchy, where the people did have a say in how the government was run. England had its famous parliament. They had it for years. But what they were worried about most of all was the collapse of absolute monarchs, which, quite frankly, it was already going out the door. With so many democracies rising up and becoming democratic, even Germany at this time had the Landtag. No. Oh boy. I need to brush up on my history again. But they did have some form of a parliament. So what these absolute monarchs, or these more totalitarian, authoritarian monarchs like Russia, Austria, and the Ottoman Empire, they're starting to realize, oh no, we're losing territory. We're going to be small and pathetic and puny. We're going to let a bunch of people, lesser people, rule us. Or break away from us. That's what their major fear was. And now, let's go talk about an assassination and a sandwich. And we're back. Now, as I said, An assassination and a sandwich. Let's see what happens. 3, 2, 1, and play.
Alright, the stage is set. Now let's put the players in their places. The curtain opens on the back of a rundown cafe in Belgrade. A young man comes in carrying a package and takes a seat at a table with a handful of other young men huddled around. They still to a hush as he opens the package. Inside is a single piece of paper, a newspaper clipping. The one who brought the package bends over to stare at the page. One of the other young men slides a candle across the table so he can better see. Before him, circled in red, is a headline, and it reads, Archduke Franz Ferdinand to visit Sarajevo. Now we skip ahead a few weeks. We're outside a palace. A resplendently dressed man and woman are getting in an open-top car, 100 years ago this year. He's dressed in bright, blazing blue. His chest is full of medals. On his head, a grand horsehair cap. She is wearing a flowing white dress and laughing. He helps her into the car. This is Franz Ferdinand, the Archduke of Austria, next in line for succession to the throne, accompanied by his wife Sophie. They've come to Sarajevo to watch military maneuvers, but really that's an excuse. It's their anniversary. They've come to get away from the stifling courts of Austria, where the Archduke's marriage to Sophie will never be accepted due to her low birth. She was, after all, only a countess. But things have been really tense in this part of the empire. The Serbian agitators have been acting with increased boldness to demand a Serbia free and independent from Austrian rule. And this day, of all days, falls on the anniversary of one of the greatest battles in Serbian history, the Battle of Kosovo. It's one of the great rallying points of the Serbian people, a point of national pride. To Serbian nationalists, this is one of their proudest days. And to them, for the Archduke of Austria, the symbol of their oppression, the embodiment of foreign rule, to come here on that day was the greatest insult. Now, perhaps the Archduke had chosen that day to show solidarity, to ease tensions, to make the people of Serbia understand that he cared about their traditions. Maybe he simply didn't know that the day had any special importance, and he was just there to get away. But whatever the reason, he was ill-informed. For on any other day, the events that are about to play out may not have happened. On any other day, this might have turned out simply to be your average parade, an event which wouldn't even go down as a historical footnote in a long and prosperous rule. But something had to happen on this day. It was too symbolic, too important. Too grand of a story. And so the first domino is placed in the mad and improbable events of this 28th day of June 1914. So here now, in the sleek black car, the royal couple begins to process down the streets of Sarajevo, flanked by 5 other cars filled with officials and guards. It's a parade. The streets are lined with onlookers, the route has been published, the world knows exactly where the Archduke is going to be. And those young men from that cafe in Belgrade are there in that crowd. They are nationalists. They're patriots. They're assassins and terrorists. They call themselves Young Serbia, and are part of the much more ominously named Black Hand. And they are angry. Angry in the way that only young men can be. And when I say young, I mean that barely any of them had reached the age of 20. They had in them an anger born of ideals, or they had ideals to rationalize their anger. A boldness born of a cause, or a cause to justify the brash kind of risk-taking that truly borders madness. But however you view them, here they were, hidden in the crowd, intent on killing the Archduke. One by one, the Archduke's car passes his would-be assassins. Nothing happens. No attempt on his life. 2 of his assassins ended up succumbing to fear and couldn't go through with the deed. One felt pity for his wife sitting in the car and just couldn't bring himself to pull the trigger. Another one had an equipment malfunction. And so, one by one, Ferdinand passed them, none the wiser, smiling and waving to the crowd, smiling and waving in an open-top car so the world could better see. But at last, on the Commercia Bridge, an assassin finally steps forward and throws a bomb at the Archduke's car. Seconds before it lands, Ferdinand sees it and dives behind the door of the car as the bomb passes over him and bounces into the street behind. An explosion rips through the ground, mangling the car following them and leaving 20 people wounded and bleeding on the street. The assassin leaps over the side of the bridge to make his escape, but in the type of amateurish planning that would be comical if the circumstances weren't so grave, he fails to realize that the river below is only 4 inches deep, and he hurts his leg in the fall. In one last act of comic tragic bravado, the assassin swallows the cyanide pill he's been carrying, a final "you'll never take me alive" gesture, but alas, these young high school assassins had bought their suicide pills on the cheap, and this one was way past its shelf life. So the young man just sits quietly vomiting into the river while the police stroll down to take him very much alive. The motorcade races back the way it came, sirens screaming, and the city begins to lock down. Another of the young men, a 19-year-old named Gavrilo Princip, watches the cars go by, heart sinking. So it's done, he thinks to himself. It's off. The Archduke is alive. The assassinations failed. He is pretty bummed out. His hopes to be immortalized in the halls of Serbian heroes are dashed. All his dreams of glory just shattered. Overall, it's been a pretty lousy day. So he goes off to pout, thinking maybe a snack will make me feel better. This one young man's comfort snack may seem like a small thing, but it's on the small things that history often turns.
Doesn't it
Back at City Hall,
always?
the Archduke and the mayor are having words. The mayor proposes that the Archduke and Duchess should continue on their trip, but the Archduke thunders back something like, "Are you crazy? You'd have us visit museums while bombs explode on your streets?" And then,
He's
in
like,
a
"I just
gesture of
dropped a
gallantry that
bomb
you don't
here."
often see anymore, he proposes instead that they immediately visit the hospital where the wounded were taken after the attack. So they don't hide him in a bunker or spirit him out of the country with a small army of guards like we would do today. Instead, they all pile out to the motorcade and start off towards the hospital. But nobody remembers to tell Franz Ferdinand's driver, and I should mention that this is the Archduke's personal chauffeur. Now, this fellow came along with the Archduke for the trip, but he's Austrian through and through. This guy does not know his way around Sarajevo. And so,
boy.
as they're making their way through the city, the Archduke's driver makes a wrong turn onto Franz Josef Street, a street named for the Archduke's father. Meanwhile, our failed assassin, Gavrilo Princip, is sitting outside a deli, eating his consolation snack and starting to feel maybe a little better. And maybe this won't be his only chance, he thinks. Maybe someday he'll have another shot at greatness. I mean, it was a really bad day, but who knows, it could still turn out okay. He'd have to go into hiding for a while, but he... Holy is that the Archduke? Yes, right there in front of him, in
Yeah.
the same open-top
I
car,
kid you
was
not,
the
people,
Archduke and his
this
wife.
actually
The driver had
happened.
taken a random wrong turn onto the street where Gavrilo Princip was
It's
having a
that
sandwich,
one
and their
little
car had just
D20 roll
stalled
that
out trying to back
screws
up.
everybody.
3 strides away. Gavrilo can hear the Archduke and his wife talking from the car. No words, just actions. He stands up, he pulls out his pistol, and he fires 2 shots that change the world. The Archduke looks over, barely noticing the gendarmes wrestling the young man by the car to the ground. His only sight is for his wife, lying quietly on the floor of the car. He reaches out with a hand weak and heavy. Something's wrong with his neck, he can't quite think straight. He sees her and he utters one last wish. "Sophie, Sophie, don't die. Live for our children." A man leans over him and asks if he's badly hurt, and he thinks he says, "It's nothing. It's nothing." He repeats the phrase, each time a little more quietly, and neither of them live through the hour. And so, our first act is done. A martyred prince and princess, or the death of oppressors. An act of terror or a heroic strike for freedom. An act that relied on 1,000 coincidences. On a poorly chosen date, on a change of plans, on a misinformed driver, and on a sad young man having a sandwich. But no matter how you look at it, it was an act that began the greatest war in history, and brought to an end the world that all of these actors knew. This war would change the world. Join us next time and find out how the world responds to this event.
And it's begun. The first casualties of World War I have happened. You know, I've heard that they say that history and the world revolves not on a chessboard, but in a dice game. Well, whoever's playing this dice game is not using the standard 6-sided die. No, they're using a D20. And apparently, in the terms of Princip here, he was rolling a lot of D20. He rolled a few D1s, but afterwards he rolled nothing but 20s. And same could be said for the Archduke. Oh man, what a mess! What a mess! And now we get to see how the rest of the world takes this gigantic mess and turns it into an utter catastrophe of a mess. First things first, of course, I'm gonna pause that. So wait right there. Okay, we're back with part 3. Let's see how the Concert of Europe fumbles this spectacularly. Let's get this started in 3, 2, 1, and play.
The 5th of July, 1914. The Archduke and Duchess are dead. Gavrilo Princip is in jail, but catastrophe is not yet certain. Act 2 begins. We open on an Austrian
Right, get your
delegation
D20s,
arriving
people.
in Potsdam. It is now a week after the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. The Austrians want to take action. They want war with the Serbs, who they think are behind the group of ragged young men that actually pulled the trigger. But before they can have their war, they decide they must consult with their much stronger ally, the German Empire. So they send a delegation to Potsdam to meet with the Kaiser, Wilhelm II. They've been restrained before by Germany, held back from acting in the Balkans, so they need to know what Germany plans to do. They go to the Kaiser and tell him that this is intolerable, that they cannot abide such a humiliation, that they cannot let this act of terrorism go unpunished. And the Kaiser says to them, "We'll back you whatever you do. Just act and act quickly. Germany is behind you, without reservation." The Kaiser thinks that general war can be avoided, that if the Austrians strike while all of Europe is enraged over this assassination, if they act while the brutal slaughter of the Archduke and Duchess is still fresh in people's minds, no one will raise a finger to defend Serbia. And even if the Russian Empire decided that they wanted to protect their Serbian allies, if the Austrians can strike quickly, it'll be a fait accompli. The war will be over before the Russians can mobilize their forces. This is what he thinks as he tells the Austrian delegation that they have a blank check, that Germany will back them whatever they do.
And then
that
type he goes of thing on vacation has worked
on a boat
before in
for
history,
3 weeks when he can't be reached. So the Austrians come home, German assurances in hand, but in Austria there's disagreement. The Hungarian part of their empire initially objects to war. They hope that a peaceful solution might be found, but their voice is alone. Where were the other voices of reason, or the other arguments for peace? Dead on the streets of Sarajevo. The Archduke was perhaps the greatest defender of the Serbs in the empire, and so when moderation was called for, the parties for war simply had to point to his death and say, "He was their greatest friend, look what they did to him, what do you think they're going to do to us?" And all arguments were quelled. So at last, the Hungarians relented on one condition, a condition that'll be important later, that the Austro-Hungarian Empire would not annex a foot of Serbian land. And with that, the Austrians began drafting an ultimatum to Serbia. But this ultimatum is delayed by a chance for peace. Two men, rivals in the heart of Serbia, in Belgrade, the very capital in the center of this crisis, are two of the only men farsighted enough to see the clouds gathering on the edge of Europe. They are the ambassador from Austria and the ambassador from Russia to Serbia. They both have come to the same conclusion about where this storm will end, so they plan to put aside their differences and meet to perhaps work out a plan for peace. On the 10th of July, the Russian ambassador arrives at the house of the ambassador from Austria-Hungary. The details are agreed to, the plan is set, all that's left is one final meeting to perhaps smooth out tensions, to avert world war. They talk, they take cigarettes, both sides are open, things are going well, and then wham! The Russian ambassador falls dead of a heart attack. Nothing signed, no war stopped. The Serbians blame the Austrians. Rumors circulate that they had the Russian ambassador assassinated, that the Austrian ambassador killed him in his own house. Worse still, this leaves the Russians without an ambassador in Serbia. As events begin to accelerate toward war, they have no diplomatic channel at the center of everything, no lines of communication, no eyes or ears on the ground. They have nobody with the experience, connections, or familiarity with Serbia that the former ambassador had to send out. And even if they did, it'd take weeks to get them appointed and shipped from Moscow to Sarajevo. Weeks they don't have. But with this last overture turning to catastrophe, the Austrians decide it's finally time to send their ultimatum. But they can't. Again, they delay. You see, President Poincaré, the leader of France, is going to Russia to meet with the Tsar, and the Austrians, ever nervous, decide that they can't send the ultimatum while their two greatest adversaries are meeting together in the same place. It would never do. They could make decisions too quickly. They could coordinate in ways they normally couldn't when they're 1,000 miles apart. So the Austrians delay. They wait until Poincaré is 100 miles out to sea before sending their ultimatum. But at last, on the 23rd of July, an ultimatum is sent, from the Austrians to the Serbs. The Serbs have 48 hours to agree to all points or face war. The ultimatum asks many things, but most of all, it asks that Austrian police be granted free rein to investigate the assassination on Serbian soil. This is impossible. To agree to such a thing is tantamount to giving up sovereignty. No nation would accept this. But that's alright, because the ultimatum is only a ruse anyway, a cover for what the Austrians really want. The Austrians want war. They want the ultimatum to be rejected, because they want to appear to the world as though they gave the Serbs a chance to avoid
They want the
conflict.
moral high ground.
They want to appear blame-free for the invasion they're planning. And here's where things begin to speed up. Europe begins to boil. Up until this point, the crisis in the Balkans is just another event on the world stage, but all of a sudden, with the release of this ultimatum, people start to clue in to what's happening. Powers outside of Austria, Germany, and Serbia begin to pay attention. But for us, we're going to turn our attention to one man, Sergei Sazonov. Sergei Sazonov was the foreign minister of Russia, and for him, the 24th of July is about to be a very, very busy day. In the morning, he wakes to receive the terms of the ultimatum that Austria sent to Serbia. He reads quietly to himself, then turns to an aide and fatefully utters, "It's a European war." A cabinet meeting is hastily assembled. The highest levels of the Russian government are all there. They resolve to ask the Austrians to give the Serbs more time, while at the same time pushing the Serbs not to resist the Austrians. They also make the fateful decision to begin a partial mobilization of their forces along the Austrian border, trying to play all the angles at once in the schizophrenic chaos that seemed all too common in the days just before the war.
Oh,
Now
yeah.
it's noon. Sazonov takes lunch with the French and British ambassador. The French ambassador reiterates France's complete support. The British ambassador says that Britain sympathizes but that he can't make any commitments. Now it's afternoon. The Russian ministers reconvene. With Sazonov confirming the unwavering support of the French, they decide to fully back Serbia, even to the point of war. And now it's evening. Sazonov meets with Portales, the ambassador from Germany. Portales begs Sazonov to call off Russian mobilization. He tells him that there must be solidarity between the monarchies, that they must work together or all fall alone. The argument gets heated. Portales tells Sazonov there will be revolution. Revolution in Europe if the monarchies do not work together. If they don't
He's
work
not
together,
wrong.
all the crowns will fall. And he's right. Within 5 years, all the great monarchies of Europe, true monarchies, monarchies where the monarch was the head of state, would collapse. Within 5 years, the Ottoman Empire, the
That's what
Austro-Hungarian
all these
Empire, the
nations were
Russian
afraid
Empire,
of.
and the German Empire would be no more. Their kings dispossessed, thousands of years of monarchical tradition burnt away in the fires of cataclysmic war. Then something tragic happens. It's one of those small tragedies that lines the path to the First World War, those things that tear you up as you read about these events with perfect hindsight. It's one of those moments that almost makes this seem like a script, like a high drama constructed for the stage, until you realize how real it is, real enough to wipe out a generation. For you see, Sazonov utters the words, "If Austria-Hungary swallows Serbia, we will go to war." Did you catch it? If not, that's alright, neither did Portales. Poor Portales, who so desperately wants to avoid war. You see, Russia's main concern was that Austria would annex Serbia. If the Austrians planned to conquer Serbia, then it had to be war. But remember earlier, when the Austro-Hungarians were arguing among themselves about the ultimatum, that Hungarian element wouldn't lend its voice to war unless the other members of the Austro-Hungarian Empire agreed that they would not annex a foot of Serbian soil. Well, nobody told Portales. He was the German ambassador, not the Austrian ambassador, and somehow the memo never got to him that the Austrians had no plans to actually take over Serbia. So in their whole discussion, he never gets to communicate this to Sazonov. This may be one of the last moments where the world could have avoided this war. Portales impassioned, begging for peace, Sazonov firmly stating the Russian case, the two diplomats meeting in the quiet St. Petersburg night. But the world hinges on small things, and in that gentle night, one of the last the world would know for years, the opportunity is missed. The hands of fate tighten around the neck of Europe. The next day, the Austrians reject demands that they extend the deadline, the Kaiser at last decides to return to Germany, and 2 minutes before the ultimatum expires, the Serbians send Austria their reply. But that's a story for next time. We'll see you then.
Yeah, you can see, this is literally absolutely insane. Diplomats were running around so much. There are stories that there were guys that didn't change their clothes for days because they were running so bad. There are stories of people sleeping at their chairs with fully dressed because they just were so scared to go home. They knew what was coming. Ugh. And now comes the final act. So stay right there, we'll finish this out. And we are here at the final act of the Seminal tragedy. This is where everything collapses. And Europe finally marches to war. This one is gonna, for historians anyway, is sometimes the hardest to read because it is at the very end when you see where we go from just like people quietly like deliberating and negotiating and trying to work out a solution to basically downright begging for not to lose because everyone knew what was probably going to happen if they all went to war. Secretly, like they get. And publicly they tried to bring up bravado and pride, but inside in private they were screaming, they were crying, they were begging, they were trying to bring whatever they could to avoid war. So let's see what happens. I know. We all know what happens. I'm just saying that for dramatic influence because, come on, where's the fun with that little drama? Anyway, let's get this video started in 3, 2, 1, and play.
The 24th of July, 1914. It's late at night. A group of haggard-looking men sit in a dim room in the ministry in Belgrade. One of them holds the Austrian ultimatum in his hands. They've spent the day debating how to reply. Defeated, they are about to give in to all demands. A notice slipped under the door. It says that the Russians have started to mobilize. They change their reply, and the final act begins. In their reply, the Serbians agree to 9 out of 10 Austrian demands. They only refuse to allow Austrian officials to have police powers within Serbia. But their reply is a masterstroke, an act of genius in the way it concludes. For at the end, it says that if the Austrians don't find their terms to be fair, the Serbians are more than willing to submit to the resolution of a conference. But if you'll remember, the Austrians hate conferences. They are always getting outvoted at those things. Well, no more. Not this time. They are livid at the Serbian reply, but like always, they turn to their German allies for advice. The Kaiser is still at sea, so Austria's foreign minister Berthold goes to consult Bethmann Hollweg and Moltke, the head of the German army. They're apoplectic. They say, "What, you haven't declared war already? A month has gone by, get on with it. This isn't what we agreed to. We're losing the sympathies of the people of Europe." You see, after the assassination of the Archduke, public opinion in Europe weighed heavily against Serbia. It was politically impossible for anybody to support them then. But now a month has passed, and this reply, this meeting of most of the Austrian demands, and this offer for mediation made the Serbs seem like the reasonable party. After all, what more could Austria want? So, with the rebukes of the Germans driving him, Berthold returns to Austria-Hungary, and for the first time speaks with Konrad von Hötzendorf, the chief of staff of the Austrian army. He too is apoplectic. What, declare war? Are you kidding me? You needed to tell us weeks ago if that's what you wanted to do. The Austrian army won't be ready for war until the 14th of August, weeks from now. Plus, we don't even know who we're mobilizing against. You want us to prepare for war with Serbia? Yeah, not when Russia's mobilized against us, we aren't. Get us a guarantee of Russian neutrality, and then maybe we can talk about mobilizing against the Serbs. Despondent, pressured toward war by the Germans, told that Austria isn't ready by his own chief of staff, Berthold returns home and begins to think. As the hours grow later, he starts to convince himself. There's a way out of this. He starts to reason that declaring war isn't necessarily the same as being at war, and so maybe if he declares war now, he'll placate the Germans and be able to use that threat to get the Serbs to capitulate before he even needs the Austrian army to be ready to fight. Now, we can all see this for the desperate rationalization that it is. We've all at one time or another gotten ourselves into an impossible situation and let ourselves believe in some wild, harebrained solution that'll surely fix everything. Only when we do that, the fate of the world isn't usually hanging in a balance. And so, on the 28th of July, Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia, with Berthold all the while believing he's going to bring peace by declaring war. But that morning, the morning of the 28th, Kaiser Wilhelm II got back to Potsdam. That very morning, the Kaiser read the Serbian response to the Austrian ultimatum and uttered, "With this, every reason for war drops away." And here is one of the great tragedies of those frantic July days leading to the war. This man, Wilhelm II, for all his inadequacies, for all his failings, for once in his life steps up and tries to become the man he should be. The man who deserves to rule the most powerful nation in the world. And he comes so close. And yet, despite his best attempt, he's too late. The world doesn't reward his effort, things spiral into chaos, war comes, and his empire will
Say
fall.
what you want about the guy,
Kaiser
but he
tries
tried.
to open peace talks.
He may have
Perhaps even
failed,
hold
but
a
he
conference,
tried.
But the Austrians will have none of it. So he proposes a novel solution: halt in Belgrade. Belgrade, the Serbian capital, is just a few miles from the Austrian border. If the Austrian army occupies the capital, they can declare victory and save face while showing the rest of Europe that they don't plan to annex Serbia. And they can do it quickly enough to perhaps keep the Russians out of the war. But this proposal has to go through Bethmann, and Bethmann's in Berlin. Now get this, it's 1914, so as impossible as it seems, there was no telephone line between Berlin and Potsdam, so Bethmann can't reply directly. He's pretty skeptical of the halt in Belgrade plan, but instead of making the drive to Potsdam for clarification, he passes it along to German agents in Austria with the instructions not to press the Austrians too hard to adopt it. And he doesn't even mention that it comes from the Kaiser himself. Meanwhile, in Russia, Sazonov gets reports of Austrians shelling Belgrade. These reports are false, of course. The Austrian army won't be ready to do anything until August 14th, but he has no way of knowing that. So he, one of the last men opposed to full Russian mobilization, lets the dam break and declares himself for a full mobilization of the Russian army. He and the Russian chief of staff, Yanushkevich, go to see the Tsar and convince him that the time has come. General mobilization is ordered. Night falls. It's 1 a.m., and the Tsar can't sleep. He sends a telegram to the Kaiser of Germany, and it reads thus: "Am glad you're back. In this serious moment, I appeal to you to help me. An ignoble war has been declared to a weak country. The indignation in Russia shared fully by me is enormous. I foresee that very soon I shall be overwhelmed by the pressure forced upon me and be forced to take extreme measures which will lead to war. To try and avoid such a calamity as a European war, I beg you in the name of our old friendship to do what you can to stop your allies from going too far. Nikki. Now you have to remember that these two men were cousins. They were friends. All the avenues of diplomacy had failed. All the standard bureaucratic mechanisms of the state were driving them to war, so they reached out to one another as cousins and as friends to see if the two of them, dealing directly person to person, could avoid this war. And in a touch that could only come from these twilight days of empire, did they not refer to each other as Tsar or Kaiser. They don't even refer to each other as Wilhelm and Nicholas, but rather as Willie and Nicky. The Kaiser is awake too, and he responds. A flurry of telegrams get sent back and forth. At the end of these correspondences, Nicholas picks up the phone, calls Yanushkevich, and tells him to call off the general mobilization. Yanushkevich splutters and starts to reel off all the things that canceling mobilization means they're gonna have to do, but the Tsar says, cancel it, and hangs up the phone. On the morning of the 30th, Sazonov hears what the Tsar has done. He's shocked. He pulls in the head of the Duma, the Russian parliament, and the Patriarch of the Orthodox Church, and they go in for a knockdown, drag-out meeting with the Tsar. The room is crowded, it's hot, talks are getting nowhere, and then Nicholas moves off alone, staring out the window at St. Petersburg, trying to think. After a few minutes of reflection, coming to no conclusion, a young man, an aide-de-camp, standing near the Tsar, says, "Majesty, we know how difficult it must be for you to decide." Without intention, these words cut. Nicholas had always been called a weak, indecisive, feckless leader, and he hated it. He wanted to shake off all those names people had been calling him for so many years. He wanted to show the world he wasn't some wishy-washy prince who couldn't make up his mind. And so, like that, with the words of some aide-de-camp whose name history has forgotten, Nicholas turns around and says, "I will sign the order." Back in Germany, Bateman's finally come around. They're starting to make progress with the Austrians on the halt in Belgrade plan. The British have even said that this plan has their support. But Berthold won't accept it. Can't accept it unless the Russians agree to halt their mobilization. And here we hit the catch-22 of the First World War. This is the age of the train, the period where logistics and timetables dominated military thinking. All around Europe, it was thought that if you could just get your army to the battlefield while the other guy's forces were still arriving, you'd crush them every time. You'd win without contest. And as we've seen with the Austrians, mobilization can take weeks. It is a Herculean task to coordinate and move the millions of men that made up a modern army.
And the Austrians were
and if
way
Russia acquiesces and has her
underpowered.
army stand down, they will be impossibly behind. If they stop mobilization, and then Austria or Germany decide to attack, they'll have lost the war without even a fight. So Russia cannot stop mobilization. But if Russia mobilizes, that means Germany has to mobilize too or face the same dilemma. And now with Germany mobilized, what can France do but mobilize themselves? After all, the Franco-Prussian War taught them a hard, bitter lesson about what happens when you get your army to the field too slowly, and they will not be making that mistake again. And so the dominoes start to fall. But there's one last attempt, one last try to stop that crushing chain of causality leading the world inexorably to war. Portales, the poor German diplomat playing a bit part in a tragedy that he has the desire but not the means to avert, has one last meeting with Sazonov. He says to Sazonov, call off the general mobilization. And Sazonov says no. Portales pleads, for God's sakes, there will be no winner in this war. If we fight, it'll be revolution. It will be the end of monarchy. It'll be the end of us both. Won't you please call off this madness? And Sazonov says, no. Portales drops to his knees and says, if you do this, it will be slaughter. I beg of you, in the name of all that is right and decent, call off this mobilization. And Sazonov says no. Then Portales rises to his feet and takes a piece of paper from his pocket and says, in that case, sir, I have the honor to inform you that we're at war. He's still struggling to collect himself, saying, never thought I'd be leaving Russia like this. I don't know how I'll be able to pack. Sazonov kindly offers to send somebody to help gather his things. And a month later, 1 million men are dead. The Seminal catastrophe has begun.
In Flanders fields the poppies blow, between the crosses row on row, that mark our place, and in the sky the larks still bravely singing fly. Scarce heard amid the guns below, we are the dead, short not sleep, though poppies grow. In Flanders fields, in Flanders
What a tragedy.
Yeah, so that's it. And then 4 years later, on, like I said, the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, World War I came to an end. Monarchies were gone. New wars began, new rivalries began, new hatreds began. And we're still feeling those effects to this day. But there is hope. There's always hope. That in learning our history, in learning the mistakes of our past, we can better ourselves in the future. And I'll always remember the men and women who serve our country, and so many others. So, thank you all for watching this video with me, and thank you to our men and women in the service. You are truly appreciated. And as always, you know who I am, I know who you are. I will see you all in the next video.